The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty Shoshone City hotel, and Zelda Lancaster pressed her gloved hand against the window, searching the crowd of weathered faces for the young man whose photograph had arrived 6 weeks earlier with his proposal of marriage. Her heart hammered beneath her corseted bodice as she studied each person waiting on the wooden sidewalk, but none matched the smooth-faced youth who had stared solemnly at the camera in that carefully staged portrait. The August heat of 1882, Idaho Territory pressed down like a heavy blanket, and sweat trickled down her spine as the driver opened the door and extended his calloused hand to help her down. "Miss Lancaster." A deep voice called out, and she turned to see a man stepping forward from the shade of the hotel's overhang. He was not young. Gray hair, streaked with remnants of what must have once been dark brown, showed beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth spoke of years under the relentless sun, and his broad shoulders filled out his dusty shirt with the solid strength of a man well into his 40s. He removed his hat, revealing more silver threads, and his blue eyes met hers with an expression that seemed equal parts hope and resignation. "I am Zelda Lancaster," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I was expecting to meet Preston Young." "I am Preston Young, madam," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her chest tighten. "The photograph you received was taken 18 years ago when I was 26. I apologize for the deception, though it was not entirely intentional. My sister sent that letter and photograph without my full knowledge of what she had written. By the time I learned of it, you had already responded, and I did not have the heart to send you back without at least meeting face to face." Zelda felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though the earth itself remained still. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, leaving behind her position as a governess in a household that no longer needed her services after the children had grown. At 24, she had seen this as her final chance for a family of her own, for the life she had dreamed of since girlhood. The young man in the photograph had seemed kind, and his few letters had been thoughtful, if brief. But this man standing before her was old enough to be her father. "You lied to me," she said, and despite her effort to keep her voice steady, it trembled with the weight of her disappointment and the fear of what came next. "Not directly, but the result is the same," Preston acknowledged. He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that spoke of genuine discomfort. "I understand if you wish to take the next stage back east. I will pay for your return ticket and provide you with funds for your trouble. It is the least I can do." The other passengers were disembarking now, and curious eyes turned toward them. Zelda felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Idaho sun. She had written to her former employer about her plans, had given up her small room in the attic, had packed everything she owned into 2 trunks. There was nothing to return to, no position waiting, no family who wanted a spinster daughter back under their roof after she had left to make her own way at 18. "I need to sit down," she said, and her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Preston moved immediately, taking her elbow with a gentle touch that somehow managed to be both respectful and steady. He guided her toward the hotel, and she was grateful for his support as her legs felt suddenly unreliable. Inside, the lobby was marginally cooler, with a large fan moving the air in slow circles. He led her to a chair upholstered in faded burgundy velvet and waited until she was seated before taking a position nearby, not too close, giving her space. "Can I get you some water? Something to eat?" he asked. "Water, please," she managed. He returned quickly with a glass and she drank deeply, the cool liquid helping to clear her head. When she looked up at him again, really looked, she saw past her initial shock to the man himself. His face was weathered but honest, his eyes kind despite the wariness in them. There was strength in his frame, yes, but also a certain gentleness in how he held himself, as if he were very aware of his own size and power and deliberately kept it in check. "Tell me the truth of everything," she said finally. "If I am to make a decision about my future, I need to know what I am deciding." Preston pulled over another chair and sat down, maintaining a respectful distance. "The truth is this," he began, his voice low and measured. "I am 44 years old. I have a ranch about 5 miles outside of town, 200 acres with cattle and horses. I built the house myself 20 years ago when I first came to this territory. I never married because I was too busy building something from nothing, and by the time I looked up from the work, I realized I was no longer a young man. My sister Emma lives in town with her husband. She worried about me being alone, so she wrote that letter and sent that old photograph. I only learned about it when you responded. Why did you not write immediately to correct the misunderstanding?" Zelda asked. "Pride, perhaps," he admitted. "Or fear. Your letters were so full of hope, and I had not heard hope in anyone's voice regarding me in a very long time. I told myself I would explain when you arrived, that seeing me in person would be better than imagining your disappointment through words on a page. I see now that I was wrong about that too." Zelda set down the glass and folded her hands in her lap. Her practical nature, honed through years of managing households and stubborn children, began to assert itself over her initial emotional response. "What were you hoping would happen when I arrived?" Preston met her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that surprised her. "I hoped that maybe, despite my age and my gray hair, you might see something worth staying for. Not love, not right away, but perhaps the possibility of it. I hoped you might see a man who would work hard to make you happy, who would treat you with respect and kindness, who would give you a home and a life that, while perhaps not what you dreamed of, might still be good. Will wisdom do instead?" She found herself saying, the words coming from some place she had not known existed. "Is that what you are offering? The wisdom of years instead of the passion of youth?" "I cannot offer you the pretty words or the romantic gestures of a young man," Preston said quietly. "But I can offer you honesty, stability, and a promise that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the chance you have taken. If you will have me, that is." Zelda stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty main street of Shoshone City. The town was small, rougher than anything she had known in Philadelphia, but there was something vital about it, something alive with possibility. Behind her, she heard Preston stand as well, but he did not approach. He was giving her time, space to think, and she appreciated that more than he could know. "I need time," she said finally, turning to face him. "I need to see this town to understand what life here would be like. I need to know who you really are, not just what you say in a moment when you hope to convince me to stay." "That is fair," Preston agreed immediately. "Emma and her husband have a spare room. You could stay with them while you decide. I will pay for your room and board, and you will be under no obligation to me at all. If after a few weeks you decide to leave, I will arrange your passage east with no questions asked." "A few weeks," Zelda repeated. It seemed both too long and too short. But what other choice did she have? Return immediately to nothing, or stay and see if this unexpected turn might lead somewhere she could not yet imagine. "I will stay," she said, and watched relief wash over Preston's weathered features. "But I make no promises beyond that." "I would not ask for any," he said, and replaced his hat. "Let me take you to Emma's. She is going to have some words for me when she learns how this has unfolded, but she will welcome you warmly. That much I can guarantee." Emma Young Thornton was indeed both welcoming and sharp-tongued. managing to embrace Zelda with genuine warmth while simultaneously scolding her brother in a way that suggested decades of sibling dynamics. She was perhaps 10 years younger than Preston, with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her husband, George, was a quiet man who ran the general store and seemed content to let his wife handle most of the talking. "You old fool," Emma said to Preston while simultaneously guiding Zelda toward a comfortable chair and pressing a cup of tea into her hands. "I sent that photograph because I thought you would write and explain, not let the poor girl travel all this way thinking she was meeting a young man." "I know," Preston said wearily. "I have already apologized, and Miss Lancaster has graciously agreed to stay for a few weeks to see if she might still consider the arrangement." Emma turned shrewd eyes on Zelda. "And what do you think, dear, now that you have seen this gray-haired brother of mine?" Zelda considered her words carefully. "I think I was foolish to accept a proposal from someone I had never met based on a photograph and a few letters. I think your brother was wrong to let me maintain my misconceptions. And I think that now that I am here, I would be even more foolish not to at least see what might be possible before making a final decision." Emma's expression softened into approval. "A practical woman. Good. My brother needs someone practical. He is too much in his head, always thinking and worrying. Now, let me show you to your room, and then we will talk about what comes next." The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the side garden where vegetables grew in neat rows despite the challenging climate. Zelda's trunks arrived shortly after, delivered by a young man from the hotel, and she began the process of unpacking, hanging her few good dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her personal items on the dresser. It felt strange to be setting up a temporary home in a place so foreign to everything she had known, but there was also something liberating about it. Here, no one knew her as the governess who had never married, the educated woman who had chosen work over finding a husband. Here, she could be anyone she chose to be. That evening, Preston came for dinner, and Zelda had her first opportunity to observe him in a relaxed setting. He was quiet, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. He listened more than he talked, and she noticed how he deferred to Emma on household matters while offering thoughtful opinions when asked about town affairs or ranching concerns. George clearly respected him, and the affection between the siblings was evident despite Emma's continued exasperation over the photograph incident. "Tell me about your ranch," Zelda said as they finished the meal of roasted chicken and vegetables. "You said you built it yourself." Preston nodded, warming to the subject. "When I first came to Idaho Territory in 1862, this area was just beginning to open up. I worked for other ranchers for several years, saved everything I could, and then filed a claim on land near the Shoshone River. The first few years were hard. I lived in a tent while I built a small cabin, then gradually expanded as the herd grew. Now I have a proper house, a good barn, and enough cattle to make a decent living." "Do you manage it alone?" she asked. "I have 2 men who work for me regularly, and I hire extra hands during roundup and branding season. It is not a massive operation like some of the big outfits further south, but it is mine, built with my own hands and my own sweat." There was pride in his voice, but it was the earned pride of someone who had worked for what he had, not the boastful pride she had sometimes encountered in Philadelphia drawing rooms. Zelda found herself interested despite her lingering uncertainty about the situation. Over the following days, Zelda began to explore Shoshone City and its surroundings. Emma took her on walks through town, introducing her to the shopkeepers and residents. The town was small, with one main street that held the essential businesses: a general store, a bank, a hotel, a saloon, a church, and a few other establishments. Beyond the main street, houses spread out in organized rows, most simple wooden structures but well maintained. In the distance, mountains rose against the endless blue sky, their peaks still holding snow even in late summer. Preston called every afternoon, always respectful, always careful not to overstay his welcome. Sometimes he brought small gifts, fresh vegetables from his garden, wildflowers he had picked on his ride into town, a book he thought she might enjoy. They were simple offerings but chosen with thought, and Zelda found herself looking forward to his visits. On the 5th day of her stay, Preston asked if she would like to see the ranch. "No obligation," he added quickly. "I simply thought you might want to see what I have been describing. Emma and George could come along if that would make you more comfortable." "I would like to see it," Zelda said, "and I do not need chaperones. I am 24 years old and quite capable of managing a wagon ride to a ranch." Emma raised an eyebrow at that but said nothing, and the next morning Preston arrived with a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He helped Zelda up onto the seat beside him, and they set off down the road that led out of town toward the river valley. The landscape was different from anything Zelda had known in the East. Sagebrush stretched in all directions, dotted with hardy grasses and occasional wildflowers that had managed to bloom despite the dry conditions. The sky seemed impossibly vast, and the silence was broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip of the horses' hooves. "It must be lonely out here," Zelda said after a while. Preston glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but there is also a peace in it. When I first came west, I was running from things back in Missouri. Family expectations, a life that felt too small for what I wanted. Out here I found space to breathe, to build something that mattered to me. The loneliness seemed a fair trade for the freedom." "And now?" she asked. "Now I am older," he said with a slight smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "And I have realized that what seemed like a fair trade at 24 feels different at 44. The land is still here, the work is still meaningful, but I find myself wishing there was someone to share it with, someone to talk to in the evenings besides my horses." The ranch appeared in the distance, nestled in a bend of the river where cottonwood trees provided shade and the grassland was greener. The house was larger than Zelda had expected, a 2-story structure with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It was built solidly of timber, with real glass windows and a stone chimney rising from the center. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, and cattle grazed peacefully in the surrounding pastures. Preston helped her down from the wagon and gestured toward the house. "Would you like to see inside?" The interior was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's home. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace, a solid wooden table, and chairs that Preston had clearly made himself. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books, and Zelda moved toward them automatically, drawn by the familiar comfort of bound volumes. "You read," she said, running her fingers along the spines. There were classics, agricultural texts, histories, and even a few volumes of poetry. "It helps pass the long winter evenings," Preston said from behind her. "And I have always believed that a man should continue learning, no matter his age." She turned to face him, seeing him now in his own space where he clearly belonged. He seemed more relaxed here, more fully himself than he had been in town. "Show me the rest," she said. He led her through the house, pointing out the features with obvious pride. There was a separate parlor with comfortable furniture and more bookshelves, a kitchen with a modern stove and good workspace, and upstairs, 3 bedrooms. One was clearly his, furnished with a large bed and simple dresser. The others were empty save for basic frames and mattresses. "I built this house larger than I needed," Preston said as they stood in one of the empty rooms. "I suppose I always hoped that someday I would need the space. Foolish, perhaps, for a man who spent so much time alone." "Not foolish," Zelda said quietly. "Hopeful." They returned downstairs, and Preston made coffee while Zelda sat at the table and looked out the window at the view of the river and mountains beyond. There was something compelling about this place, something that spoke to a part of her she had not known existed during her years in Philadelphia. It was wild and open, full of possibility and also challenge. "What would my life be like here?" she asked as Preston set a cup of coffee in front of her and took a seat across the table. "Be honest with me." Preston wrapped his hands around his own cup, his expression serious. "It would be hard work," he said. "This is not a life of leisure. There would be cooking and cleaning, tending the garden, preserving food for winter, sometimes helping with ranch work during busy seasons. The winters are cold and long, and we can be snowed in for days at a time. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away and town is 5 miles. You would spend a lot of time alone, especially when I am out working the range." "That sounds isolating," Zelda said. "It can be," Preston agreed, "but it can also be peaceful. And it would not be like being a governess, responsible to someone else's schedule and demands. This would be your home, your domain. You would have freedom to organize it as you wish, to fill your time as you choose. And you would have me, for whatever that is worth." Zelda studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Tell me why you never married before. The truth, not a polite version." Preston was quiet for a long moment, and she waited, sensing that his answer mattered. "When I was younger, I was too focused on building this place," he said finally. "Every penny went into land and cattle, every hour into work. I told myself there would be time later for courting and marriage. Then, as I got older, I became aware of how much older I was getting. The young women in town seemed like children to me, and the women my own age were already married or had no interest in ranch life. I convinced myself it did not matter, that I was content alone. But lately, I have been watching Emma with George, seeing how they move through life as partners, and I have realized what I have missed. I want that companionship, that partnership. And when Emma sent that letter, even though I knew it was foolish, I let myself hope. Hope that a young woman would overlook your gray hair for a chance at her ranch," Zelda said, not unkindly. "Hope that someone might see past the gray hair to the man underneath," Preston corrected gently. "Someone who might value the same things I do. Honesty, hard work, building a life that matters. I know I am not young and handsome, but I am not a bad man, Zelda. I would do my best to be a good husband." The way he said her name with such careful respect made something shift in her chest. She set down her coffee cup and stood, moving to the window. Outside, the cattle grazed peacefully and a hawk circled overhead against the brilliant blue sky. "I need more time," she said without turning around, "but I am not saying no." "That is more than I had any right to expect," Preston said, and she heard the relief in his voice. They stayed at the ranch for another hour, with Preston showing her the garden and barn, introducing her to his horses, and explaining the daily rhythms of ranch life. Zelda asked questions, practical ones about water sources and food storage and what happened in emergencies. Preston answered everything honestly, never trying to paint the life as easier than it was, and she respected him for that. On the ride back to town, they talked more easily, the conversation flowing from books they had read to observations about the landscape, to stories from their different pasts. Preston told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children, and how he had always felt constrained by expectations and small-town thinking. Zelda shared her own history. Raised in a Philadelphia family of modest means, educated beyond what was typical for women of her class, determined to support herself rather than accept an unwanted marriage proposal from a merchant's son. "You turned down a proposal before?" Preston asked with interest. "When I was 20, Zelda confirmed. "He was a nice enough man, but he made it clear that once we married, my education would be wasted. He wanted a wife who would manage his household and produce children and have no thoughts beyond his comfort. I chose work instead." "And yet you answered my sister's letter proposing marriage to a stranger," Preston observed. "I am 4 years older now," Zelda said, "and I have learned that there are different kinds of constraints. Being a governess gave me independence, but it also meant I was always in someone else's home, always aware that my position was temporary and dependent on their goodwill. When your letter came, I saw a chance for a home of my own, for a partnership where I might have some say in how life unfolds. Even if I was wrong about your age, perhaps I was not wrong about that possibility." Preston glanced at her, something warm in his eyes. "Perhaps not," he agreed quietly. Over the next 2 weeks a pattern developed. Preston visited every day, sometimes staying for a meal with Emma and George, sometimes taking Zelda for rides around the area so she could see more of the territory. They talked endlessly, discovering shared interests and laughing over differences. Zelda found herself noticing things about him. The way he always helped Emma without being asked, the gentleness with which he handled his horses, the thoughtful pauses before he spoke as if he weighed each word for its truth. She also saw how the townspeople treated him. They respected Preston Young. Ranchers asked his advice on cattle management and water rights. Shopkeepers greeted him warmly. Even the sheriff, a gruff man named Dalton, clearly valued Preston's opinion on town matters. He was a man who had built not just a ranch but a reputation, and that mattered in a place like Shoshone City. Emma, watching Zelda watch her brother, said quietly one evening as they sat on the porch shelling peas, "He is a good man. I know the age difference bothers you, and it should, honestly. But Preston has more life in him than men half his age. He takes care of himself, works hard, and has a generous heart. If you can see past the gray hair, you might find something worth having." "I am beginning to see that," Zelda admitted, "but it is still strange. When I imagined marriage, I imagined growing old together from youth. This feels like skipping ahead to the middle chapters." "Perhaps," Emma said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps it is like starting a book where the author has already done the hard work of establishing who the characters are. You know who Preston is. He is not going to suddenly reveal some terrible hidden flaw or change into someone different. What you see is what you would get. There is something to be said for that certainty." Zelda considered this as she watched the sun set over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible. Emma was right in a way. Preston was established, settled, clear about who he was and what he wanted. There would be no years of struggling together to build something from nothing, but there would also be stability, security, and the wisdom he had gained from his years of experience. The question was whether she could love him. Not the young man from the photograph, but this gray-haired cowboy who spoke carefully and moved with the steady confidence of someone who knew his own capabilities. Could wisdom substitute for youth? Could respect and growing affection become love? On the 18th day after her arrival, Preston took Zelda back to the ranch for a picnic. He had packed a basket himself, and they rode out to a spot by the river where the cottonwoods provided shade, and the sound of water over rocks created a peaceful backdrop. They sat on a blanket he had brought, eating cold chicken and fresh bread, drinking cool water from the river, and talking in the easy way they had developed. "I leave the decision to you entirely," Preston said as they finished the meal, "but I would like to know your thoughts." You have been here nearly 3 weeks now. Have you seen enough to know what you want to do? Zelda had known this conversation was coming. She had spent the previous night lying awake in her borrowed bedroom, turning the question over and over in her mind. I have seen enough to know that I do not want to return to Philadelphia, she said carefully. I have seen enough to know that you are a good man who would treat me well and provide a secure home. I have seen enough to know that I enjoy your company and respect your character. But, Preston prompted gently, but I do not know if I can love you, Zelda said honestly. Not yet, and I worry that the age difference will matter more as years pass, that I will be nursing an old man when I am still in my middle years. Preston nodded slowly, absorbing this. Those are fair concerns, he said. I cannot promise you that the age difference will not matter. I am 20 years older than you, and that is a fact that will not change. But I can tell you that my father lived to be 78 and my grandfather to 82. The men in my family tend toward longevity if accident or illness does not take them first. And as for love, I would not expect you to love me now. Love is something that grows, or so I believe. What I am asking is whether you think it might be possible for love to grow, given time and care. Zelda picked at the grass beside the blanket, her mind working through the implications. If I say yes, she said slowly, I would want certain understandings between us. Name them, Preston said immediately. I would want to continue my education, to have access to books and learning. I would want a say in decisions about the ranch and our life, not to be treated as merely a housekeeper. And I would want time after we marry, before we talk about children. I need to know that this partnership works before we bring others into it. Preston met her eyes steadily. I would never want to stop you from learning. Half the books in that house are there because I value education, and I would be glad to have someone to discuss them with. As for decisions, I have managed this ranch alone for 20 years, but I have no interest in a wife who is merely decorative. I would value your input and partnership, and as for children, that is entirely your decision. If you want them, I would be honored. If you never want them or want to wait years, that is also your right. I will not pressure you. You make it sound simple, Zelda said. It is not simple, Preston acknowledged. Marriage never is, from what I have observed, but it can be good if both people commit to making it work, to treating each other with respect and kindness even when things are difficult. That is what I am offering, Zelda. Not perfection, but honest effort. Zelda looked at him, really looked, seeing not the gray hair or the age lines but the steady character underneath. He had been nothing but honest with her since that first difficult meeting. He had given her time and space, had answered every question, had made no demands. And somewhere over the past weeks, her initial disappointment and shock had transformed into something else. A tentative affection, a growing respect, and a curiosity about what life with this man might be like. Yes, she said, and watched surprise and joy transform his weathered features. I will marry you, Preston Young. Not because I love you yet, but because I believe I could learn to love you, and because I think we might build something good together. Preston reached for her hand, the first truly personal touch between them, and his grip was warm and solid. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I promise you will not regret this. I will spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust. See that you do, Zelda said, but she smiled as she said it, and the answering smile on Preston's face made him look younger, the years falling away to reveal the man he might have been in that old photograph. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Shoshone City, with Emma and George as witnesses and most of the town in attendance. Zelda wore a simple dress of pale blue that Emma had helped her alter, and Preston wore his best suit, his gray hair neatly trimmed and his boots polished to a shine. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional, but when Preston slipped the ring onto Zelda's finger and kissed her gently, she felt a flutter of something that might have been the beginning of love, or at least the possibility of it. The ride to the ranch as husband and wife felt different from all the previous times Zelda had made the journey. This time, she was not a visitor but coming home. Preston seemed to sense her nervousness, and he kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation about the changes he had made to prepare for her arrival. New curtains for the bedroom, additional kitchen supplies, a rocking chair he had built and placed on the porch because she had mentioned once that she liked to sit and watch the sunset. That night, Preston was patient and gentle with her, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable with each step. It was her first time, and he seemed to understand without being told, his experience evident in the way he guided her through initial awkwardness into something unexpectedly sweet. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Preston's steady breathing beside her, Zelda felt a strange contentment settle over her. It was not the passionate romance she had read about in novels, but it was good and real, and that mattered more than she had expected. The next morning, Zelda woke early and found Preston already up making coffee in the kitchen. He turned when he heard her on the stairs, and his smile was warm and genuine. "Good morning, wife," he said, and the word sent an unexpected thrill through her. "Good morning, husband," she replied, testing out the word. They fell into routines over the following weeks. Preston taught Zelda about ranch management, showing her the account books and explaining how he tracked expenses and profits. She taught him about more efficient kitchen organization and brought order to his somewhat haphazard filing system for ranch paperwork. They read together in the evenings, sometimes aloud to each other, and talked about everything from philosophy to politics to whether they should plant apple trees near the house. The work was indeed hard, as Preston had warned. Zelda's hands, soft from years of indoor work, developed calluses from gardening and housework. She learned to churn butter, preserve vegetables, and manage the enormous task of keeping a household running without the conveniences she had known in Philadelphia. But there was satisfaction in the work too, in seeing the direct results of her labor, in knowing that what she was building was her own. The first real test of their marriage came in October, when one of Preston's ranch hands was injured in an accident with a spooked horse. The man, a young fellow named Timothy, had been thrown and broken his leg badly. Preston and Zelda brought him to the ranch house, and Zelda found herself nursing him while Preston rode for the doctor. The doctor, when he finally arrived, set the leg but warned that infection was a serious risk. For 3 days, Zelda sat with Timothy, monitoring his fever, changing bandages, and making sure he drank enough water and ate enough to keep his strength up. Preston managed both the ranch work and helping her when he could, and she saw a new side of him during those long days. His genuine concern for his employee, his willingness to do whatever necessary to help, his steady presence even when exhausted. Timothy recovered, thanks largely to Zelda's careful nursing, and the story spread through the community. People began to see Zelda not just as Preston's mail-order bride but as a capable woman in her own right, someone who could be counted on in a crisis. It changed how she was treated in town, the subtle shift from polite distance to genuine acceptance. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in mid-November and temperatures dropping sharply. Preston had been right about being snowed in. There were stretches of a week or more when leaving the ranch was impossible. But rather than feeling trapped, Zelda found a certain coziness in those winter days. She and Preston would work together on indoor projects. He repaired tack and tools while she sewed or worked on her endless list of household tasks. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, reading or talking, and gradually, Zelda began to realize that she was happy. It was a different kind of happiness than she had imagined in her youth, less dramatic and passionate but deeper and more stable. She valued Preston's steady presence, his thoughtfulness, the way he listened to her opinions and took them seriously. She appreciated his quiet humor, and the way he seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. And physically, their relationship had developed into something comfortable and satisfying, built on trust and mutual consideration rather than fiery passion. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire with snow falling heavily outside, Preston reached over and took her hand. "Are you content?" he asked quietly. "Truly content, not just making the best of things?" Zelda considered the question seriously, as he deserved. "I am," she said finally. "It is not the life I imagined, but it is a good life, better than I had any right to expect when I stepped off that stagecoach and saw your gray hair instead of a young man's smooth face." Preston chuckled, the sound warm and rich. "I will never forget the look on your face that day," he said. "Pure shock and disappointment. I thought for certain you would take the next stage back east." "I nearly did," Zelda admitted. "But something made me stay, curiosity perhaps, or desperation. Now I am glad I did." "You were right when you said wisdom could be valuable. You have taught me so much about this life, about managing the ranch, about finding contentment in simple things. A younger man might not have had that to offer. And you have brought life back to this house," Preston said. "It was just a building before, a place to sleep between work. Now it is a home. That is your doing, Zelda." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. It was in moments like these that Zelda realized love had crept up on her quietly, without fanfare or dramatic declarations. She loved this gray-haired cowboy who read poetry and built rocking chairs and treated her like a partner rather than a possession. It was not the love she had imagined, but it was real and solid and true. Spring brought its own challenges and joys. The snow melted, revealing the land renewed and ready for another season of growth. Preston taught Zelda to ride properly, and she found unexpected joy in the freedom of galloping across the open range with the wind in her hair. They worked together during calving season, staying up late to check on expectant cows and rejoicing when new calves appeared healthy and strong. In May, Emma announced that she was expecting a baby, news that filled Zelda with a complicated mix of emotions. She was happy for her sister-in-law, but the announcement also raised questions about her own future. She and Preston had not talked seriously about children since before their marriage. Both of them focused on building their partnership first. But now, 9 months into their marriage, Zelda found herself wondering what she wanted. She brought it up one evening as they worked together in the garden, planting vegetables for the summer harvest. "Emma told me today that the baby is due in November," she said, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. "She is excited, though also nervous about the birth." "Emma will do fine," Preston said confidently. "She has always been strong." "Do you want children?" Zelda asked directly, deciding that circling around the topic would not serve them well. Preston sat back on his heels, his hands dusty with soil, and met her eyes. "I want whatever you want," he said carefully. "A year ago I would have said no, that I was too old to be starting a family. But then you came into my life and you have changed many things I thought I knew for certain. If you want children, I would welcome them. If you do not, I am content with the life we have built together. This is your decision, Zelda. Your body, your risk, your choice." "I think I do want children," Zelda said slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke. "Not immediately, perhaps, but soon. I want to see what we could create together. What a child with your steadiness and my stubbornness might be like." Preston smiled at that, one of his rare full smiles that crinkled his eyes and made him look almost young. "That would be something to see," he agreed. "But let us take our time." "There is no rush, we have time." But time, as it turned out, had its own plans. In July, Zelda realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week, not wanting to get her hopes up, then another. By August, there was no denying it, she was pregnant. The doctor in town confirmed it, estimating that the baby would arrive in late February or early March. Preston's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Joy mixed with concern, excitement tempered with determination to take care of her. He immediately began fussing over her, insisting she not lift heavy things and worrying about whether she was eating enough. It was almost annoying, except that she could see the genuine love behind his concern. "I am pregnant, not ill," she told him finally after he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I can manage normal tasks." "I know," Preston said, running a hand through his gray hair in frustration. "But you are my wife, carrying my child, and the thought of anything happening to you terrifies me." The raw honesty in his voice made Zelda's irritation melt away. She took his weathered face in her hands and kissed him gently. "I am healthy and strong. The doctor says everything is progressing normally. You have to trust that I will be all right." "I am trying," Preston said, "but you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Zelda. The thought of losing you is unbearable." "You are not going to lose me," she said firmly. "I am far too stubborn to let something like childbirth defeat me." Emma's baby, a healthy boy they named Matthew, arrived in early November. Zelda went to stay with Emma for the birth, both to help and to see what she might expect in a few months. The birth was difficult, as births often were, but Emma came through it safely, and Zelda held baby Matthew with a mix of wonder and trepidation, trying to imagine herself in Emma's position. Winter settled in again, and Zelda grew larger, her movements becoming awkward as the baby pressed on her lungs and bladder. Preston hovered constantly, and she alternated between appreciation for his care and frustration at being treated like fragile china. They converted one of the empty upstairs rooms into a nursery, with Preston building a beautiful cradle from oak wood and Zelda sewing blankets and tiny clothes. In late February, Zelda woke in the early morning hours with pains low in her back. She lay still for a moment, timing them, then woke Preston. "I think it is time," she said, and watched his face go pale in the dim lamplight. "I will ride for the doctor," he said, already moving. "Not yet," Zelda said, catching his hand. "The pains are still far apart. Stay with me for now. We will send for the doctor when things progress." They moved through the hours together, Preston's steadying presence helping Zelda through the increasingly intense contractions. By mid-morning, he rode to fetch the doctor and Emma, and by afternoon, Zelda was in the grip of hard labor. It was more difficult than she had imagined, more painful and exhausting, and there were moments when she wondered if her confident words about surviving childbirth had been foolish boasts. But Preston never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. And when the baby finally arrived as the sun was setting, a healthy boy with a surprisingly loud cry, Preston had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," Preston said, cradling the tiny bundle with surprising gentleness for such large, work-roughened hands. "You are perfect. Thank you, Zelda. Thank you for this gift." They named the baby Peter after Preston's father, with the middle name Young continuing the family name. Zelda recovered well from the birth, though she was exhausted in ways she had never experienced. Preston took over much of the household work in addition to his ranch duties, somehow managing to care for her, the baby, and the ranch all at once. She saw yet another side of him during those weeks. His capacity for nurturing, his willingness to do whatever was needed without complaint. As spring arrived and baby Peter grew stronger and more alert, Zelda found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Nearly 2 years had passed since she had stepped off that stagecoach expecting a young man and found a gray-haired cowboy instead. She had been so disappointed, so uncertain, so ready to flee back to the familiar even if it meant accepting defeat. Now, watching Preston rock their son while reading aloud from a book of poetry, she could not imagine her life any other way. He had been right that day at the ranch when he asked if wisdom could do instead of youth. His wisdom had guided her through learning to live in this harsh but beautiful land. His patience had given her time to grow into love. His steadiness had provided the foundation on which they built this life together. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, looking up from his book. "That I was a fool to judge you by your gray hair," Zelda said honestly. "That you have been everything you promised and more. That I love you, Preston Young, more than I knew it was possible to love another person." Preston set the book aside carefully, still holding the sleeping baby, and reached for her hand. "I love you too," he said quietly. "From that first moment when you looked at me with such disappointment, I have been trying to prove myself worthy of you. I hope I have succeeded at least a little." "More than a little," Zelda assured him. "You have given me a home, a family, and a partnership I treasure. What more could I possibly ask for? The years that followed brought both challenges and joys." Peter grew into a lively, curious child who loved following his father around the ranch and listening to his mother read stories. When Peter was 3, Zelda gave birth to twin girls, Alice and Rose, who filled the house with noise and laughter. Preston, now in his early 50s, proved just as capable of chasing after 3 young children as any younger father, his patient nature perfectly suited to fatherhood. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Zelda's organizational skills and education proved valuable in negotiating with buyers and managing the business side of the operation, while Preston's years of experience guided the practical aspects of ranching. They became known in the territory as a successful partnership, proof that a good marriage was built on mutual respect and shared work rather than age or appearance. Emma and George's family grew as well, with 2 more children following Matthew. The cousins spent considerable time together, and Zelda cherished the friendship that had deepened between her and Emma over the years. Emma never missed an opportunity to remind Preston how close he had come to losing Zelda through his initial deception, but always with affection and gratitude that things had worked out despite his foolishness. As the children grew, Preston taught them about ranching, instilling in them his values of hard work, honesty, and respect for the land. Zelda made sure they were educated, setting aside time each day for lessons and reading. The house was always full of books, conversation, and the comfortable chaos of family life. One evening in the summer of 1895, when Peter was 11 and the twins were 8, the family sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Preston, his hair now fully white but his blue eyes still sharp, sat in the rocking chair he had built for Zelda 13 years earlier. She sat beside him in a matching chair he had made later, their hands linked between them. The children played in the yard, their laughter floating on the warm evening air. "You remember the day I arrived?" Zelda asked quietly, watching their children. "How shocked I was to see your gray hair," Preston chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "I remember thinking I had made the biggest mistake of my life, letting Emma send that letter. I was certain you would leave on the next stage." I almost did, Zelda admitted. But something made me stay. Curiosity, desperation, or perhaps fate. Now I look at all of this, at our children and our home and the life we have built, and I cannot imagine how different things might have been. Would you change anything? Preston asked. If you could go back and meet that young man from the photograph instead of the gray-haired cowboy I was. Zelda turned to look at him, seeing the years etched even deeper now in his weathered face, the white hair that had once been such a shock, the lines around his eyes from years of smiling. She saw the man who had promised her honesty and partnership and had delivered on that promise every single day. She saw the father who read bedtime stories and taught patient lessons. She saw the husband who still brought her wildflowers from the range and built furniture with his own hands for their home. I would not change a single thing, she said firmly. That young man in the photograph might have been handsome, but he would not have been you. And you, Preston Young, with all your wisdom and gray hair, are exactly who I needed, who I still need. Preston lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. And you, Zelda Young, are the best thing that ever happened to this old cowboy. You brought life and love to a man who thought his time for such things had passed. Every day with you has been a gift I never expected to receive. Peter came running up to the porch then, his face flushed with excitement. Papa, will you teach me that rope trick you showed me yesterday? I almost have it, but I need you to show me one more time. Preston rose with the easy movement of a man who had kept himself fit despite his years. Of course, son. Bring me the rope. As Preston worked with Peter, demonstrating the intricate patterns of trick roping, Alice and Rose begged their mother for a story. Zelda gathered them close and began to tell them about a princess who traveled far from home to marry a prince, only to discover he was much older than she expected. But the prince proved to be wise and kind, and together they built a kingdom filled with love and laughter. Is that story about you and Papa? Alice asked shrewdly when the story ended. Perhaps a little, Zelda admitted with a smile. Though your papa is certainly no prince, just a hard-working cowboy. But you love him anyway, Rose stated matter-of-factly. I love him because of who he is, not despite it, Zelda corrected gently. Remember that, girls. True love is not about surface things like youth or beauty. It is about character, kindness, and partnership. It is about finding someone who makes you better and whom you can make better in return. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the family moved inside for supper. Around the table, over a meal Zelda and Preston had prepared together, they shared stories of their day. Peter talked excitedly about a new calf that had been born. Alice described the drawing she was working on. Rose asked complicated questions about the stars and constellations. Preston and Zelda exchanged glances across the table, the kind of wordless communication that came from years of partnership. After the children were in bed, Zelda and Preston sat together in their bedroom, the window open to let in the cool night air. Preston was reading while Zelda worked on mending one of Peter's shirts that had torn during his adventures. You ever think about what might have happened if things had gone differently? Preston asked suddenly, setting down his book. If you had refused me that day and returned east? Zelda set down her mending and moved to sit beside him on the bed. Sometimes, she admitted, but only to remind myself how fortunate I am. I would have returned to a life of employment in someone else's home, always temporary, always constrained. Instead, I have this, a home that is truly mine, children I love, and a husband who treats me as an equal partner. How many women can say that? And I would have continued alone, Preston said quietly. Growing older in this house I built, with only my books and my horses for company. I would have told myself I was content, but I would have been lying. You saved me from that, Zelda. You gave me a reason to care about the future, to build something lasting beyond just the ranch. We saved each other, Zelda said, taking his hand. You gave me a home and a place in the world. I gave you companionship and family. It has been a fair trade, I think. More than fair, Preston agreed. He pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Will wisdom do instead? You asked me that first day when you saw my gray hair. I did not know how to answer then. But now I would say yes, wisdom can do more than you might expect. It brought us this life, this love, this family. That seems sufficient proof to me. More than sufficient, Zelda murmured, already drowsy. It brought us everything. Years continued to pass, bringing the changes that time always brings. The children grew into young adults, each finding their own path. Peter took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving to have inherited his father's steady nature and his mother's sharp mind for business. Alice discovered a talent for art and eventually opened a small studio in Shoshone City, painting portraits and landscapes that captured the wild beauty of Idaho territory. Rose's curiosity about the stars led her to teaching, and she became the school teacher for the growing community. Preston's hair remained white, and more lines appeared on his face, but he remained active and healthy well into his 60s, defying Zelda's early fears that she would be left a young widow. They continued to work together on the ranch, though they gradually hired more help to handle the physical labor. Their partnership deepened with each passing year, built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that had grown from that uncertain beginning. Emma and George remained close friends and family. Emma never let Preston forget how he had nearly bungled everything with that old photograph, but she always said it with love. She and Zelda remained confidants, sharing the joys and challenges of raising children and managing households in the still wild Idaho territory. As Idaho progressed toward statehood, which it achieved in 1890, Preston and Zelda became respected members of their community. They were known for their fair treatment of employees, their willingness to help neighbors in need, and the strong family they had built together. Their home became a gathering place for celebrations and difficult times alike, a center of stability in a region still finding its footing. One autumn evening in 1900, as Zelda and Preston celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary, they rode out together to the spot by the river where Preston had proposed so many years earlier. The cottonwood trees were turning gold, and the river sang its eternal song over the rocks. 18 years, Zelda said, dismounting and spreading a blanket on the grass. It seems both longer and shorter than that. Preston joined her on the blanket, moving a bit more stiffly now at 58 but still capable and strong. Do you regret any of it? He asked, the question that still sometimes surfaced despite all the years of happiness. Not one single moment, Zelda said firmly. She was 42 now, still beautiful though her face showed the character that came from living a full life. Even the hard times, the struggles and the doubts, they all led to this. I am exactly where I want to be with exactly who I want to be with. Preston kissed her then, a kiss that held all the tenderness of 18 years of marriage, all the passion that had never really faded, and all the deep love that had grown from uncertain beginnings into something unshakable. You are still the best decision I ever made, Preston said when they drew apart. Even if I had to resort to my sister's trickery and an old photograph to bring you here. And you are still the gray-haired cowboy who asked if wisdom would do instead of youth, Zelda replied with a smile. The answer, as I have told you many times, is yes. Wisdom did more than suffice. It gave me everything I did not know I was looking for. They sat together as the sun set, watching the sky turn brilliant with color, comfortable in the silence that came from knowing each other so completely. 3 children, a successful ranch, 18 years of partnership, and a love that had surprised them both with its depth and durability. It was not the life either of them had imagined, but it was better than anything they could have planned. Years later, when their grandchildren asked how they had met, Zelda would tell them the story of arriving in Shoshone City, expecting a young man and finding a gray-haired cowboy instead. She would describe her shock and disappointment, her near decision to leave, and the gradual realization that wisdom and character mattered more than youth and appearance. "Your grandfather asked me if wisdom would do instead," she would tell them, her eyes finding Preston across the room where he sat reading to the youngest grandchildren. "And I learned that wisdom does not just do instead, it does better. It builds stronger foundations. It creates deeper love. It gives you a partnership that can weather any storm." Preston, hearing this as he always did, would look up and smile at her, that same warm smile that had first made her think perhaps, just perhaps, this might work after all. And Zelda would smile back, grateful every single day for that moment of courage when she decided to stay, to give this unlikely match a chance, to see if a gray-haired cowboy's wisdom could truly substitute for a young man's passion. It had been more than enough. It had been everything. The end came peacefully for Preston Young in the winter of 1915, at the age of 73. He passed away in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Zelda for 33 years, in the house he had built with his own hands. His children and grandchildren surrounded him in those final days, and his last words were to Zelda, telling her one more time that she had been the best thing that ever happened to him. Zelda, now 57, mourned deeply but without regret. They had been given more years together than she had dared hope for that day, when she first saw his gray hair, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. She had learned to love him completely, to appreciate every day they had together, and to value the wisdom he had brought to their partnership. She lived another 20 years, remaining active in the ranch that Peter now ran with his own family, delighting in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and always grateful for the choice she had made to stay in Shoshone City all those years ago. When her own time came, surrounded by the family she and Preston had built together, Zelda's last thoughts were of that first day, of Preston standing in the dusty street asking if wisdom would do instead of youth. She smiled as she let go, ready to tell him once more that, yes, his wisdom had done more than enough. It had given her a life filled with love, purpose, and a happiness she had never imagined possible. The gray-haired cowboy had been exactly who she needed, and their love story, unlikely as it had seemed at the start, had been the greatest adventure of her life.